It is a gray, suffocating morning on 7th Avenue in Manhattan. The date is September 15, 2008. The air is humid, clinging to the skin, but inside the glass tower of Lehman Brothers, the temperature has dropped to absolute zero. On the street below, a spectacle is unfolding that looks less like high finance and more like a funeral procession. Men in $5,000 Italian suits are stumbling out of the revolving doors, clutching cardboard boxes filled with family photos, staplers, and stress balls. Some are weeping openly, others are staring at the pavement, their faces drained of blood, looking as if they have just witnessed a murder. In a way, they have. Behind them, the digital tickers are screaming the news that nobody believed could happen. The 158-year-old titan, the bank that survived the Civil War, the Great Depression, and 2 world wars, is dead. It didn't just fail, it was erased. Inside the boardroom on the 31st floor, the silence is deafening. The coffee is cold. The phones have stopped ringing because there is no one left to answer. This isn't just a bankruptcy, it is the financial equivalent of a nuclear detonation, the shock wave of which is already racing across the Atlantic to shatter economies in London, Tokyo, and Dubai. The world has changed in a heartbeat, and it all began with a shopkeeper from Bavaria who just wanted to sell cotton. To understand how the world broke, we must trace the cracks back to the foundation. Subscribe and join us as we exhume the dynasty that built American capitalism only to bury it under a mountain of greed. The Cotton Kings of Alabama. The story of the financial apocalypse does not begin with a computer screen or a stock ticker. It begins with a wagon. It begins in the red, choking dust of Alabama in 1844, where a 23-year-old immigrant named Henry Lehman is trying to breathe. He has just arrived from Rimpar, a tiny village in Bavaria, fleeing a Europe where laws dictate where Jews can live and what they can own. Here, in the raw, humid heat of the American South, there are no such laws. There is only the land, the sun, and the relentless ambition of a man who has traveled 4,000 miles to sell fabrics, cutlery, and hope to farmers who have little of either. Henry is soon joined by his brothers Emmanuel and Mayer. They are not bankers, they are peddlers, a word that carries the scent of road dust and sweat. They open a small general store in Montgomery, a town that smells of unpaved streets and horses. The sign above the door is simple, H. Lehman. Later it changes to Lehman and Bro, and finally, Lehman Brothers. Inside, the air is thick with the smell of dry goods, coffee beans, denim, seeds, and sugar. They are the middlemen of the frontier, the connective tissue between the industrial North and the agrarian South. But in Alabama, there is only one king, and his name is Cotton. The white fluff is everywhere, drifting like snow in the streets, sticking to the black coats of the brothers, filling the air with a haze of wealth and brutality. The farmers who come into the Lehman store have plenty of cotton, but very little cash. Their wealth is in the ground, not in their pockets. One day, a farmer places a bale of raw cotton on the counter to pay for his supplies. Henry Lehman looks at the bale, then at the ledger. He makes a calculation that will change the world. He accepts the cotton. He accepts it at a discount, of course. He knows the price in New York is higher. He realizes in that moment that trading the commodity is far more profitable than selling the shovel used to grow it. The brothers begin to accept cotton as currency. They become unintentional traders. They fill the back of their store, then a warehouse with the white gold of the South. They are no longer just shopkeepers, they are speculators. They are betting on the future price of a harvest, gambling against the weather and the market. This pivot transforms them. By the 1850s, the general store is a memory. The Lehmans are now cotton factors, financing the planters, underwriting the crops, and shipping the bales north. They move with the confidence of men who have cracked the code of capitalism. But their empire is built on a volcano. The cotton they trade is picked by enslaved hands. The wealth of Montgomery and the wealth of the Lehmans is inextricably tied to the brutal machinery of slavery. The brothers, focused on the ledger, do not see or choose to ignore the moral rot beneath the floorboards. They see only the numbers, and the numbers are spectacular. Then, in 1855, tragedy strikes. Henry, the visionary, the patriarch, contracts yellow fever in New Orleans. The disease is swift and merciless. Within days, the man who brought the family to America is dead. He is buried in a stranger's grave, far from the Bavarian hills of his birth. Emmanuel and Mayer are left alone. They stand over the ledger, grief-stricken but pragmatic. They do not close the business, they expand. Emmanuel looks at the map and points to the north. He says, "The money is in New York. The center of gravity is shifting." But before they can fully ascend, the ground cracks open. In 1861, the cannons fire on Fort Sumter. The Civil War has begun. The cotton trade, the lifeblood of their business, is now illegal across the Union blockade. The South is burning. Montgomery is no longer a boomtown. It is the capital of a doomed confederacy. The brothers are caught on the wrong side of history. Mayer stays in the South, navigating the collapsing economy, while Emmanuel is trapped in New York. The connection is severed. The firm is effectively cut in half by a wall of bayonets.
The Civil War was not just a conflict of armies, it was a strangulation of commerce. For the Lehman Brothers, it was an existential crisis. Mayer Lehman, stuck in Alabama, watched as the King Cotton myth unraveled. The Union Navy had established a blockade, the Anaconda Plan, squeezing the life out of the southern ports. The bales of cotton that had once been gold were now just flammable piles of fiber rotting on the wharves. But Mayer was a Lehman, and Lehmans did not wait for conditions to improve, they engineered them. He became a master of the gray zone. He worked with the Confederate government, not out of ideological fervor for the lost cause, but out of the pragmatic necessity of a businessman protecting his assets. The South had no factories, no steel, no medicine. It needed everything, and it had only one thing to trade. Mayer helped organize the blockade runners, fast, sleek ships that slipped past the Union gunboats in the dead of night, carrying cotton out to Liverpool and bringing back guns, medicine, and gold. It was dangerous, high-stakes smuggling, and it kept the firm alive while the world burned. In 1864, the governor of Alabama appointed Mayer to help manage the state's chaotic finances. He was tasked with raising funds for Confederate prisoners of war in the North. He found himself traveling to Richmond, the doomed capital, walking streets that smelled of gunpowder and desperation. He saw the inflation that was eating the South alive, a loaf of bread costing what a horse used to cost. He saw the Confederate currency, printed on cheap paper, turning into confetti. Meanwhile, in New York, Emmanuel Lehman was living in a different universe. The North was booming. The war had supercharged industry. Factories were churning out uniforms and rifles. Wall Street was awash in greenbacks. Emmanuel walked the cobblestones of lower Manhattan, looking at the construction, the steamships, the sheer kinetic energy of the Union. He realized a hard truth. The South was finished. The agricultural aristocracy was dying. The future belonged to the machines and the banks of the North. He worked quietly, maintaining the firm's reputation, waiting for the smoke to clear so he could pull his brother out of the rubble. When the guns finally fell silent in 1865, the devastation was absolute. Mayer looked out at a South that had been broken. The railroads were twisted metal, the fields were scorched, the enslaved people were free, the plantation economy was shattered, and the debts owed to the Lehman store were uncollectible. The Confederate dollars in his safe were worthless paper. If they stayed in Alabama, they would be kings of a graveyard. The brothers made the decision that would define their legacy. They would not rebuild the general store. They would not try to resurrect the Old South. They would abandon Montgomery. Mayer packed his bags. He left the red clay and the humidity for the granite and steel of New York City. They established their headquarters at 119 Liberty Street. The sign didn't change. It still said Lehman Brothers, but the soul of the company had mutated. They were no longer just trading merchants, they were becoming merchant bankers. They understood that the South, though ruined, still needed to rebuild. Alabama needed money to plant the next crop. New York had the money. The Lehmans became the bridge. They raised capital in the North to lend to the South, taking cotton as collateral. They were financing the reconstruction of the very land they had just fled. But Emmanuel had a bigger vision. He saw that the war had created a new type of economy, a national economy. The railroads were expanding west, the telegraph was shrinking time. The brothers began to look beyond commodities. They looked at the bonds of the railroad companies. They looked at the debt of states. They realized that trading the idea of money was infinitely more scalable than trading physical goods. They were stepping out of the warehouse and onto the trading floor. In 1887, they joined the New York Stock Exchange. It was a club of elites, dominated by the Protestant establishment, the Morgans, the Astors, the Vanderbilts. The Lehmans were outsiders. They were Jewish immigrants with German accents. They were not invited to the yacht clubs or the summer homes in Newport, so they built their own world. They created a network of Jewish banking families, Goldman Sachs, Kuhn Loeb, Lazard Frères. They intermarried, they dined together, they did business together. They became our crowd, a parallel aristocracy of finance that would rival the old money of the WASP elite. By the turn of the century, the transformation was complete. The smell of raw cotton had been replaced by the scent of mahogany and cigar smoke. The Lehman offices in New York were no longer a trading post, they were a sanctuary of capitalism. Emmanuel and Mayer, now old men with white beards and heavy watch chains, sat at the head of a table that controlled the flow of millions of dollars. They had survived the yellow fever, the Civil War, and the economic panics of the 1870s and 90s. They had proven that the Lehman name was fireproof. But the world was shifting again. The Industrial Revolution was maturing into the Consumer Revolution. America was no longer just growing crops, it was buying things. People wanted sewing machines, bicycles, and factory-made clothes. Emmanuel Lehman, ever the visionary, saw that the future wasn't just in financing the production of goods, but in financing the consumption of them. He began to look at a new type of business, the department store. While the WASP banks like J.P. Morgan focused on steel and railroads, heavy industry, the Lehmans focused on the soft economy. They saw value where others saw fluff.
This was the final evolution of the first generation. They were pivoting from being cotton kings to being the architects of consumption. But time, the one commodity they could not trade, was running out. In 1897, Mayer Lehman died. The man who had kept the firm alive in the ruins of the Confederacy, the man who had smuggled gold through blockades, was gone. The partnership, which had always been a brotherhood, was now just a business. Emmanuel soldiered on alone for another decade, the last of the three brothers who had walked out of Bavaria. When he died in 1907, it marked the end of the immigrant era of the firm. The founding fathers were buried, the wagon was rotting in the history books. The keys to the empire were handed to the second generation, specifically to Emmanuel's son, Philip Lehman. Philip was not an immigrant. He had been born in New York. He did not speak with a German accent. He spoke with the clipped, confident cadence of the American upper class. He had never peddled cutlery on a dirt road. He had never known hunger. He was the first prince of the dynasty, and he had no intention of looking back at the cotton fields. He looked at the skyline of New York, which was rising higher every day, and he decided that Lehman Brothers would rise with it. The shopkeepers were dead. The master of the universe had arrived. As Philip took the chair at the head of the table, the air in the room changed. The caution of the survivors was replaced by the aggression of the conquerors. They had conquered the South. Now they were going to buy America. The architects of the Gilded Age. New York City in the early 1900s was a machine of noise and steel. The skyline was piercing the clouds, the subway was digging into the earth, and the air smelled of coal smoke and unbridled optimism. This was the Gilded Age, a time when titans walked the earth: Rockefeller, Carnegie, Morgan. But while J.P. Morgan was forging steel and laying tracks, Philip Lehman sat in his office at 16 William Street and looked at something else, the shopping list of the American housewife.
Philip, the son of Emmanuel, was a man of severe elegance. He collected Renaissance paintings and silence. He was not a warm man, but he possessed a cold, brilliant vision. He realized that the industrial age had solved the problem of production. Factories could make anything. The new problem was distribution. How do you get millions of shirts, shoes, and tires into the hands of millions of people? The old banking establishment, dominated by white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, looked down on the retail trade. They viewed shopkeepers as vulgar. They preferred to lend money to railroads and governments. Philip Lehman saw this snobbery as an opportunity. He realized that the future of banking wasn't just in the smokestacks, but in the store counters. In 1906, Philip forged a historic alliance with his good friend Henry Goldman, the head of Goldman Sachs. Together, they invented the modern retail IPO, initial public offering. They approached a mail-order company out of Chicago that was selling everything from watches to prefab houses, Sears, Roebuck & Co. The WASP banks wouldn't touch it. They didn't know how to value a company whose assets were inventory and goodwill rather than blast furnaces. Lehman and Goldman did. They looked at the catalog found in every farmhouse in America and saw a gold mine. They took Sears public. It was a sensation. They had turned a merchant into a blue-chip stock. They didn't stop there. They went on a spree that defined the American high street. F.W. Woolworth, R.H. Macy & Co., Gimbel Brothers, B.F. Goodrich. If you bought it in a store in the 1910s or 20s, chances are Lehman Brothers financed the shelf it sat on. They were the architects of the consumer society. They were funding the democratization of luxury, making it possible for a factory worker to dress like a gentleman. But despite their immense success, the Lehmans remained outsiders. Wall Street was strictly segregated. There was the Christian banking world, Morgan, First National, National City, and the Jewish banking world, Lehman, Goldman, Kuhn Loeb. The two circles rarely intersected. J.P. Morgan would not invite Philip Lehman to his library. The Union League Club was closed to them, so the Jewish bankers built their own aristocracy. They called it our crowd. It was a world of intense privacy and intermarriage. The Lehmans married the Lewisons, the Loebs married the Schiffs. They lived in the same Upper East Side neighborhoods, vacationed in the same seaside towns, and sat on the same boards. It was a golden cage lined with velvet. Inside Lehman Brothers, the atmosphere was more like a family dinner than a corporation. The partners were all family members. Decisions were made over cigar smoke, not spreadsheets. A handshake was binding. If a partner gave his word, the capital of the firm was committed. There were no compliance departments, no risk officers, no lawyers vetting every sentence. It was a business of honor, run by men who believed their name was their most valuable asset. This era reached its zenith in the Roaring '20s. The stock market became a national obsession. Elevator boys were giving stock tips to millionaires. The Lehmans, now led by Philip and his son Bobby Lehman, rode the wave. Bobby was the dashing prince of the dynasty, polo-playing, art collecting, Yale-educated. He brought a touch of glamour to the somber world of finance. Under his influence, Lehman Brothers invested in the new technologies of the age, aviation, radio, and cinema. They funded RKO Pictures and Paramount. They weren't just selling goods anymore, they were selling dreams.
The party seemed like it would never end. The ticker tape machine in the Lehman lobby chattered incessantly, printing money with every click. The Dow Jones Industrial Average climbed higher and higher, a stairway to heaven built on margin debt and euphoria. Philip Lehman, now an old man, watched it with a seasoned eye, perhaps remembering the cotton fields and the panics of the past. He knew the trees do not grow to the sky, but even he could not predict the violence of the storm that was gathering over the Atlantic. On October 24, 1929, the music stopped. It began as a murmur on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange and swelled into a scream. Black Thursday. Traders who just days before had been masters of the universe were now clawing at each other to sell. The ticker tape lagged hours behind the trading, meaning the prices flashing on the board were already ghosts of the past. The real prices were vastly, terrifyingly lower. By the following Tuesday, Black Tuesday, the illusion of permanent prosperity had shattered. The sidewalk outside the stock exchange was packed with a silent, stunned mob. Men in bowler hats stared up at the stone facade as if waiting for a verdict from God. Rumors flew that bankers were jumping from windows, their bodies landing on the cobblestones like fallen gargoyles. Inside the Lehman offices, the mood was grim but controlled. Philip Lehman and his son Bobby Lehman watched the destruction of wealth with the stoicism of undertakers. The Lehmans were exposed, certainly. They held millions in stocks that were now plummeting toward zero. But unlike the speculators who had bought on 90% margin, the Lehmans had real capital. They had the shopkeeper's caution bred into their bones from the Alabama days. They didn't panic. They didn't sell the furniture. They stood their ground. While other banks called in loans, forcing their clients into bankruptcy to save their own skins, Lehman Brothers made a strategic decision that would become legendary. They supported their clients. When department stores and retail giants called, terrified that their credit lines would be cut, Bobby Lehman told them, "We are still open." It was a gamble on the character of America. He bet that the country would not end, that people would eventually buy shoes and shirts again. This loyalty forged bonds of steel. Clients like Federated Department Stores, Macy's, and Gimbel's would remember for decades that when the world was ending, Lehman Brothers held the line. But the Great Depression was a crucible. The easy money of the 20s was gone. The 1930s were a gray, grinding slog. Philip Lehman, the architect of the retail boom, retired into his art collection, surrounded by silent Madonnas and Dutch masters. The helm was now fully in the hands of Robert "Bobby" Lehman. Bobby was a paradox. He was a short, dapper man who smoked cigars and loved racehorses. He didn't look like a titan of industry. He looked like a bon vivant. But behind the heavy-lidded eyes was a genius for intuition. He realized that the old economy, railroads and coal, was stagnant. To survive the Depression, Lehman had to find the new economy. He turned his eyes to the sky. While the rest of the country was standing in breadlines, Bobby saw the future in aviation. He financed Pan-American World Airways when flying across the ocean was considered a suicide mission. He backed the motion picture studios, RKO, Paramount, 20th Century Fox, understanding that in miserable times people would pay a nickel to escape into the dark of a cinema for 2 hours. He poured money into the oil fields of Texas, financing companies like Kerr-McGee. Bobby Lehman transformed the firm from a conservative family partnership into a dynamic investment bank. He had an uncanny ability to spot talent. He didn't care about a man's pedigree. He cared about his brain. He began to hire outside the family, bringing in sharp, hungry economists and thinkers. He created the one-firm culture, where partners shared profits equally, eliminating the infighting that plagued other banks. For 30 years, Bobby Lehman was Lehman Brothers. He ruled like a benevolent dictator, settling disputes over lunch in his private dining room, surrounded by his personal art collection, which hung on the office walls. Under Bobby, Lehman Brothers survived the Great Depression and the Second World War. They emerged in the 1950s not just as a survivor, but as a pillar of the American establishment. They were the bankers for the post-war boom. When America built the suburbs, Lehman financed the construction. When America bought cars, Lehman financed the rubber and the steel. But every empire has a sunset. Bobby Lehman had one fatal flaw, common to great kings. He did not believe he would ever die.
He refused to name a successor. He refused to retire. He kept the reins tight in his hands, even as they began to shake with age. He created a court where he was the sun and everyone else was a planet orbiting him. The stability of the firm depended entirely on his heartbeat. On August 9, 1969, Robert "Bobby" Lehman died. With his last breath, the dynasty effectively ended. The funeral was a gathering of the American elite, a sea of black umbrellas and somber faces. But beneath the eulogies there was a current of panic. For 40 years, Bobby had been the center of gravity. He had no son involved in the business. There was no Lehman waiting in the wings to take the throne. The partners looked at each other across the open grave, and for the first time in 119 years, they realized they were orphans.
The transition was jarring. The art collection, the Rembrandts, the Goyas, the Renoirs that had lined the office hallways, giving the bank the feel of a museum, was taken down. It was auctioned off or donated to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The walls of 1 William Street were suddenly bare. It was a visual metaphor that everyone understood. The age of the Renaissance banker was over. The soul of the firm had been crated up and shipped away. Without the unifying force of a family patriarch, the firm fractured. The partners, once bound by the one firm philosophy, devolved into warring tribes. It became a battle of egos. On one side were the investment bankers, the smooth-talking, Ivy League-educated deal-makers who wined and dined CEOs. On the other side were the traders, the men in the pit, often from working-class backgrounds, who screamed orders and moved millions of dollars in seconds. Under Bobby, the bankers had ruled, and the traders were treated like help. But the markets were changing. The 1970s were approaching, a decade of inflation, volatility, and aggression. The traders were starting to make more money than the bankers, and they wanted a seat at the head of the table. The leadership fell to a committee of squabbling partners, none of whom possessed Bobby's magic. The firm began to drift. Profits slumped. The "our crowd" solidarity evaporated, replaced by sharp elbows and office politics. They moved headquarters to Water Street, a soulless glass box that lacked the history and gravitas of their old home. As the Gilded Age faded into the rearview mirror, a new, harder reality came into focus. The handshake deals were gone. The loyalty was gone. Lehman Brothers was no longer a family heirloom. It was a kill-or-be-killed contest for capital. In the shadows of the trading floor, a new breed of animal was stirring. Men who didn't care about the history of cotton or department stores. Men who only cared about the P&L statement at the end of the day. The gentlemen were leaving the building. The wolves were scratching at the door. And inside the boardroom, the empty chair of Bobby Lehman sat like a ghost, haunting the men who were about to tear his legacy apart. The death of the partnership. If the 1920s were the party, the 1970s were the street fight. Wall Street had changed. The dignified silence of the private library was replaced by the guttural roar of the trading floor. The air inside Lehman Brothers was no longer scented with cigar smoke and old leather. It reeked of stale coffee, sweat, and fear. The firm was adrift. The leadership vacuum left by Bobby Lehman had turned the partners into a pit of vipers fighting over a shrinking pie. By 1973, the firm was hemorrhaging money. The capital was drying up. The unthinkable was whispered in the hallways. Lehman might fail. Into this burning building walked a man who looked like he belonged on a movie poster, Peter G. Peterson. Pete Peterson was the ultimate insider. He had been the Secretary of Commerce under Richard Nixon. He was tall, impeccably tailored, with a voice like warm velvet, and a Rolodex that included every CEO and head of state in the Western world. He was brought in to save the sinking ship.
Peterson was a banker in the purest sense. He believed that the business of Lehman Brothers was relationships. You wooed a client over a 5-course lunch at the River Club, you listened to their problems, and you offered them sage advice on mergers and acquisitions. He was the face of the firm, the diplomat, the rainmaker. Under his steady hand, Lehman stabilized. He cut costs, fired dead weight, and restored the firm's reputation among the global elite. He made Lehman profitable again. But while Peterson was charming prime ministers in the boardroom, a monster was growing in the basement. Louis Glucksman was everything Pete Peterson was not. Short, rumpled, and perpetually angry, Glucksman was a man of the pit. He ran the trading division. He didn't care about lunch. He ate sandwiches at his desk with his shirt unbuttoned, screaming into 2 telephones at once. He didn't care about relationships. He cared about the spread, the tiny sliver of profit made on buying and selling bonds. To Glucksman, the bankers were parasites. They were suit fillers who floated around on expense accounts while he and his traders were down in the trenches making the real money. And he was right. The economics of Wall Street were shifting tectonically. The high fees for banking advice were shrinking. The real profits were now coming from proprietary trading, gambling with the firm's own money. Glucksman's division was generating millions of dollars a day, turning the lights on for the rest of the building. He looked at Peterson's polished shoes and perfect hair, and he felt a burning resentment. He felt like the engine room stoker who was keeping the ship moving while the captain took bows on the deck. The tension between these 2 men, the patrician and the pugilist, became the defining war of Lehman Brothers. It was a class war. Peterson represented the old establishment, Ivy League, social register, our crowd. Glucksman represented the new Wall Street, meritocratic, brutal, and hungry. He hired guys from Queens and Brooklyn, guys who hadn't gone to Yale, guys who would rip your throat out for a basis point. Under Peterson, trying to appease the beast, he made a fatal error. He tried to appease the beast. In 1983, thinking he could tame the Glucksman by giving him respect, Peterson promoted him to co-CEO. He thought they would rule as equals, the banker and the trader, balancing the firm. He invited Glucksman to his elegant apartment to celebrate.
Glucksman didn't want a partnership. He wanted a coronation. The arrangement lasted less than 2 months. The atmosphere in the office became toxic. Glucksman began to undermine Peterson at every turn, packing the compensation committee with his own loyalists, cutting the bonuses of the bankers, and funneling the money to his traders. He was starving the old guard to feed the new wolves. Then, on a humid afternoon in July 1983, the coup happened. It was a scene straight out of Shakespeare, played out in corporate beige. Glucksman walked into Peterson's office, closed the door, and delivered the ultimatum. "I want to run the business alone," he said. There was no shouting. There was no negotiation. Glucksman made it clear, "It's me or you. And I have the traders. I have the profit. I have the power." Peterson looked at the man he had promoted, the man he had saved from obscurity. He saw the writing on the wall. The firm had changed. The era of the diplomat was over. The era of the killer had begun. Peterson agreed to leave. He took a golden parachute and walked out the door, leaving the keys to the asylum in the hands of the head inmate. Lou Glucksman had won the crown, but he quickly discovered that it was made of lead. The coup that ousted Peterson sent shockwaves through the firm. The investment bankers, the men who controlled the relationships with the Fortune 500, were furious. They viewed Glucksman as a usurper, a barbarian who had stormed the Winter Palace. They stopped working. They stopped making calls. They sat in their offices, reading newspapers, waiting for the ship to hit the rocks. It was a silent mutiny. And the rocks were coming. In the cruelest twist of fate, the very thing Glucksman had bet the firm on, trading,
collapsed. As 1983 turned into 1984, the bond market turned sour. Interest rates spiked. The proprietary trading desk, which had been printing money, suddenly started burning it. Glucksman, the genius of the pit, was helpless. He was a general who had executed his best admirals just before a naval battle. Without the steady, boring fees from the banking side to cushion the blow, the trading losses were catastrophic. The atmosphere at 55 Water Street turned from toxic to funereal. The firm's capital, the lifeblood of any bank, was evaporating. The partners, who had once looked at their shares in Lehman Brothers as a golden ticket, now watched their net worth vanish by the hour. Panic set in. The partners were no longer brothers. They were terrified individuals looking for a lifeboat. They realized that to save their own fortunes, they had to sell the firm. It was a humiliating admission. For 134 years, Lehman Brothers had been independent. They had survived the Civil War and the Great Depression on their own terms. Now, after less than a year of Glucksman's rule, they were putting up a for sale sign. They found a buyer in the form of a corporate behemoth, American Express, specifically their brokerage arm, Shearson. It was a cultural mismatch of epic proportions. Lehman was elite, arrogant, and bespoke. Shearson was mass market, aggressive, and corporate. It was like a discount department store buying a high-end boutique. But beggars cannot be choosers. On April 10, 1984, the deal was announced. Lehman Brothers was sold for $360 million. To the outside world, it looked like a merger. To the insiders, it was a funeral. The partners cashed out, taking their millions and fleeing the sinking ship. Lou Glucksman, the man who wanted to rule alone, was demoted to a consultant. He wandered the halls like a ghost for a few months before quietly leaving. The name changed. It was now Shearson Lehman. The Brothers was dropped, then added back, then hyphenated. The identity crisis was total. The firm ceased to be a private partnership. It was now a subsidiary of a credit card company. The men and women who worked there were no longer owners. They were employees. They reported to managers, who reported to executives, who reported to a board of directors that cared about quarterly earnings, not history. The soul of the firm was excised. The one-firm culture of Bobby Lehman was replaced by the cold, hard metrics of corporate America. The art was gone. The family was gone. The partners were gone. What remained was a brand name, a zombie bank that American Express was trying to use to lend credibility to its financial supermarket. But in the shadows of this corporate merger, a survivor was waiting. He was a man who had been a Glucksman loyalist, a trader with a face like a clenched fist and a temper to match. He had watched the Civil War, watched the sale, and watched the chaos. While others left, he stayed. He began to climb the ladder of the new soulless hierarchy. His name was Richard S. Fuld, Jr., and he was biding his time. For 10 years, Lehman Brothers wandered in the desert. Under the umbrella of American Express, the firm was a prisoner. The unique alchemy of the partnership, the risk-taking, the camaraderie, was suffocated by layers of middle management and bureaucratic sludge. The bankers who had once advised presidents were now filling out timesheets. The traders who had moved markets were now worried about compliance seminars. The name Lehman was becoming a footnote, a dusty relic attached to the flashy Shearson brand. But inside the beast, a resistance movement was forming. In the center of it was Richard S. Fuld, Jr.
Fuld was not a smooth talker. He was a creature of the trading floor, a man who communicated in grunts, stares, and expletives. They called him the gorilla. He had been a Glucksman disciple, a man who learned the business in the trenches of the bond market. He possessed an intense, almost terrifying loyalty to the Lehman tribe. He hated American Express. He hated the tourists from corporate who didn't understand risk. He spent the decade climbing the internal ladder, protecting his people and plotting the escape. By the early 1990s, the marriage between American Express and Lehman was failing. The financial supermarket concept hadn't worked. Profits were volatile, and the conservative credit card executives were tired of the roller coaster earnings of an investment bank. They wanted out. In 1994, American Express decided to spin off Lehman Brothers. But it wasn't a benevolent liberation, it was an eviction. They loaded the new independent Lehman with bad assets and barely enough capital to keep the lights on. They effectively dumped the firm on the side of the road, stripped of its wealth, and told it to walk. When the new stock ticker symbol LEH flashed on the screen in 1994, there was no champagne. The market looked at this new Lehman Brothers and saw a corpse walking. The press called them the cat with 9 lives. Competitors like Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley, who had remained independent and grown massive, circled like sharks, poaching talent and stealing clients. Everyone predicted Lehman would be bought out or bankrupt within a year. Richard Fuld, now the CEO, sat in his office and looked at the battlefield. He was the captain of a life raft surrounded by battleships. He knew the numbers. Lehman was too small. It was undercapitalized. In the banking world, capital is armor. If you have it, you can take a hit. If you don't, one bad trade can kill you. Lehman had no armor. This scarcity defined the new culture. Fuld declared a state of siege. He instituted a culture of us against the world. He demanded absolute loyalty. He cut costs with a machete. And crucially, to compete with the giants, he decided that Lehman had to be smarter, faster, and riskier. Since they didn't have the money to play it safe, they had to gamble. They couldn't afford to be just a bank, they had to be a hedge fund in disguise. Fuld turned the weakness into a weapon. He rallied the troops with speeches that were part locker room pep talk, part religious revival. He told them that they were the underdogs, the rejects, the fighters. He forged a deep, cult-like identity. If you worked at Lehman, you were a soldier. And soldiers don't ask questions, they follow the general. The strategy worked. Against all odds, the stock began to climb. The profits began to return. The industry watched in shock as the gorilla dragged the corpse of Lehman Brothers back from the grave. But in his desperation to survive, Fuld had planted the seeds of the ultimate destruction. To bridge the gap with his rivals, he began to embrace leverage, borrowing massive amounts of money to amplify returns. He was building a skyscraper on a foundation of debt, betting everything that the music would never stop again.
The gorilla and the casino. By the turn of the millennium, Lehman Brothers had shed the skin of the polite family-run partnership. It was now a mirror image of the man sitting in the corner office on the 31st floor. Richard Fuld was not just a CEO, he was a monarch. In the halls of the new headquarters in Times Square, a building wrapped in digital screens that screamed stock prices to the tourists below, Fuld was feared and revered in equal measure. He had saved the firm in 1994. He had taken a dying animal and turned it into a predator. But the trauma of that near-death experience had left a permanent scar. Fuld was obsessed with growth. He was paranoid about being small. In the jungle of Wall Street, small animals get eaten. To be safe, Lehman had to be big. And to get big without the massive deposits of a commercial bank like Citi or Chase, they had to gamble. The strategy was simple, elegant, and lethal. Leverage. Lehman Brothers began to borrow immense sums of money to amplify their bets. For every dollar of their own money, they borrowed 30.
It was like driving a Ferrari at 200 miles per hour. As long as the road is straight, you are the fastest thing on earth. If you hit a pebble, you disintegrate. But for a long time, the road was perfectly straight. The engine of this growth was the housing market. In the early 2000s, America was in love with real estate. Interest rates were historically low. The government wanted everyone to own a home. Wall Street saw an opportunity to turn the American dream into a financial product. Lehman Brothers dove into the mortgage business with the ferocity of a starving shark. They didn't just buy mortgages from other banks, they bought the originators. They bought the lenders who were signing up waitresses and truck drivers for $500,000 loans in Nevada and Florida. They wanted to own the entire supply chain. Inside the firm, the culture shifted from us against the world to eat what you kill. The hero was no longer the prudent banker. It was the wizard who could invent a new derivative. They created collateralized debt obligations and synthetic CDOs. These were complex towers of debt, slicing and dicing thousands of risky mortgages into tranches stamped with a AAA rating by compliant rating agencies and sold to pension funds in Norway and municipalities in Japan. To the traders, it was alchemy. They were turning lead into gold. They were taking the risk of a mechanic in Arizona defaulting on his mortgage and spreading it so thin that it seemed to disappear.
But the risk didn't disappear. It accumulated. It sat on Lehman's balance sheet like toxic waste buried under a playground. Fuld, isolated in his executive suite, surrounded by yes-men who were terrified to bring him bad news, looked at the profits and saw only victory. In 2005, 2006, and 2007, Lehman reported record earnings. The bonuses were astronomical. Managing directors were buying Hampton's estates and Ferraris with cash. The stock price soared to $86. They felt invincible. They had mastered the universe. Fuld was hailed as the best CEO on Wall Street. He was given awards. He was on magazine covers. But he had created a culture where dissent was treason. When a risk officer raised a hand to suggest that housing prices might not go up forever, they were marginalized or fired. The gorilla didn't want to hear about gravity. He wanted to hear about the next quarter. He was steering the ship into an iceberg, but he was doing it at full speed, convinced that the ice would shatter before the hull did. In 2007, the first tremors of the earthquake were felt. The subprime mortgage market, the toxic sludge at the bottom of the housing boom, began to crack. Borrowers with teaser rates couldn't pay when their interest rates reset. Foreclosures spiked. In the sterile, air-conditioned trading floors of New York, the screens started flashing red. But at Lehman Brothers, the reaction was not panic, it was arrogance. They had survived the 1994 spin-off. They had survived the 1998 Russian debt crisis. They had survived 9/11 when their offices were destroyed and they had to trade from hotel rooms. They believed survival was their birthright. When the market for subprime mortgages froze, instead of backing away, Lehman doubled down. Fuld and his lieutenants believed this was just a blip, a dislocation in the market. While competitors like Goldman Sachs began quietly selling off their toxic assets, hedging against the disaster, Lehman went on a buying spree. They bought Archstone, a massive real estate investment trust, for $22 billion at the absolute peak of the market. It was a deal made of hubris, a bet that real estate was the one asset class that could never fail. It was the financial equivalent of buying a ticket on the Titanic after it had already hit the iceberg. As 2008 dawned, the atmosphere on Wall Street turned grim. In March, Bear Stearns, the smallest of the investment banks, collapsed in a matter of days. It was a shocking, lightning-fast death. The Federal Reserve stepped in and orchestrated a forced sale to J.P. Morgan Chase for pennies on the dollar. The message was clear. The government would not let a major bank simply vanish. There was a Fed put, a safety net. Richard Fuld looked at the Bear Stearns wreckage and drew the wrong conclusion. He believed he was safe. He believed Lehman was too big, too important, too connected to fail. He believed that Hank Paulson, the Treasury Secretary and former CEO of rival Goldman Sachs, would never let the system collapse. Fuld retreated further into his bunker. He became increasingly detached from reality. When hedge fund managers like David Einhorn began publicly questioning Lehman's accounting, calling the firm a black box filled with bad loans, Fuld took it personally. He didn't see it as financial analysis, he saw it as an attack. He raged against the shorts, vowing to squeeze them until they broke. "I want to reach in, rip out their hearts, and eat them before they die," Fuld reportedly told his executives. It was the language of a gladiator, not a banker. But you cannot fight math with machismo. By the summer of 2008, the stock was in free fall. The Lehman Brothers sign in Times Square was no longer a symbol of power, it was a target. Potential investors, the Koreans, the Chinese, Warren Buffett, came to kick the tires. They looked at the books and walked away. They saw what Fuld refused to see. The firm was technically insolvent. The real estate assets on the books were valued at fantasy prices. If they marked them to market, to what they actually worth, Lehman was bankrupt. Fuld refused to sell lowball offers for the company. He still thought Lehman was worth $40 or $50. He was negotiating for a price that existed only in his memory. He was trying to sell a burning house for the price of a palace. And while he haggled, the fire spread to the foundation. June of 2008 was the beginning of the end. For the first time since going public in 1994, Lehman Brothers reported a quarterly loss, $2.8 billion. The number was staggering, but the psychological blow was worse. The myth of Lehman's invincibility was shattered. Wall Street smelled blood. To appease the angry gods of the market, Richard Fuld did the only thing he could think of. He offered up human sacrifices. He fired his CFO, Aaron Callan, the bright face of the firm who had been reassuring investors on CNBC just weeks before. Then, in a moment of Shakespearean tragedy, he fired his president and COO, Joe Gregory. Gregory had been Fuld's partner for 30 years, his shadow, his best friend. But the survival of the firm demanded blood. He cut them loose, hoping that throwing bodies off the sled would satisfy the wolves chasing them. It didn't work. The market didn't want heads, it wanted capital, it wanted cash. Throughout the suffocating heat of July and August, Fuld frantically tried to find a buyer. He courted the Korean Development Bank. The Koreans were interested. They saw an opportunity to buy a legendary American brand for a discount. But even at the edge of the precipice, Fuld could not let go of his pride. He demanded a premium price. He haggled over book value. He treated the negotiation like a poker game, bluffing with a hand that everyone knew was empty. The Koreans, frustrated by his arrogance and alarmed by the deepening rot in the U.S. housing market, walked away.
When the news broke on Tuesday, September 9, that the talks with KDB were dead, the floor fell out. Lehman's stock plunged 45% in a single day. It was a run on the bank, but not like the old days with lines of people on the sidewalk. This was a digital run. It was silent, invisible, and instant. Hedge funds and institutional clients, terrified that their money would be trapped in a bankrupt firm, began to pull their accounts. Billions of dollars in liquidity evaporated in seconds. The wires were burning hot with transfer requests. J.P. Morgan and Citibank, the clearing banks that processed Lehman's trades, demanded billions in extra collateral to keep the lines open. They were tightening the noose. Inside the Lehman Tower, the employees watched their life savings vanish on the TV screens mounted above the trading floor. These were people who had been paid in stock, who had kept their retirement in stock, who believed the gorilla would always find a way. Now they saw the stock trading at single digits, $7, $4. People were crying in the bathrooms. The cafeteria was silent. The air was thick with the smell of fear, a primal chemical scent that comes when a herd realizes there is no escape. Fuld sat in his office, calling everyone. He called the Fed, he called the Treasury, he called competitors, but the lines were going dead. The government, led by Hank Paulson and Fed Chairman Ben Bernanke, had made a secret decision. There would be no bailout. They had saved Bear Stearns, and they had just nationalized Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac days earlier. They were done. They decided that the moral hazard was too high, that if they saved every reckless bank, nobody would ever learn. Lehman Brothers was going to be the example. They were going to let the boy who cried wolf get eaten. On Friday afternoon, September 12, 2008, the stock closed at $3.65. It was over. The liquidity was gone. The firm could not open for business on Monday. As the sun set over Manhattan, casting long shadows across the canyons of Wall Street, the summons went out. The heads of the major banks, the CEOs of Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, Merrill Lynch, Citigroup, were ordered to report to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York at 6 p.m. They were told to cancel their weekend plans. They were told to bring their lawyers. The fate of the global economy was going to be decided in a fortress of limestone and gold on Liberty Street. Richard Fuld was not invited to the meeting. He was the patient on the operating table, and the surgeons were gathering to decide whether to save him or let him die. The weekend that broke the world. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York at 33 Liberty Street is a fortress. Built in the style of a Florentine palazzo, its walls are made of massive sandstone blocks, and its windows are barred with iron. 5 stories below street level, in a vault carved out of the bedrock of Manhattan, sits the largest hoard of gold in the world, greater even than Fort Knox. But on the evening of September 12, 2008, the real weight in the building wasn't gold, it was fear. At 6 p.m., a procession of black town cars began to arrive. Out stepped the most powerful men in global finance: Lloyd Blankfen of Goldman Sachs, John Mack of Morgan Stanley, Jamie Dimon of J.P. Morgan Chase, and Vikram Pandit of Citigroup. These were the masters of the universe, men who controlled trillions of dollars, men who were accustomed to commanding the world. But as they walked through the bronze doors and into the conference rooms, they looked small. They looked like schoolboys called to the principal's office. They were greeted by Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson and the president of the New York Fed, Tim Geithner. The message delivered was blunt and terrifying. There will be no government money, Paulson told them. Lehman Brothers is bleeding to death. If it dies, it will take the rest of you with it. You have to fix this. You have to put up the money to save your rival. It was a surreal demand. These men had spent their careers trying to destroy each other. Now they were being asked to form a lifeboat to save the competitor they hated most. The air in the room was thick with suspicion. They knew that if Lehman fell, the shockwave would hit Merrill Lynch next, then Morgan Stanley, then Goldman. It was a line of dominoes, and the first one was already tipping. Meanwhile, a few blocks away at the Lehman headquarters on 7th Avenue, a different kind of drama was playing out. The building was a hive of desperate activity. Teams of bankers from Bank of America and Barclays, the 2 potential buyers, were swarming over the books. They were performing due diligence, a polite term for an autopsy on a living patient. They were tearing through Lehman's ledgers, looking at the real estate assets, the derivatives, the toxic sludge that Fuld had hidden away. What they found was worse than anyone had imagined. The real estate portfolio was a black hole. Properties valued at billions were actually worth a fraction of that. The Archstone deal, Fuld's great gamble, was a disaster. The bankers from Bank of America looked at the numbers and shook their heads. Within hours, Bank of America pulled out. They didn't want Lehman. They wanted Merrill Lynch, which was also teetering but had a better retail network. In a stunning side deal that happened almost instantly, Bank of America agreed to buy Merrill, leaving Lehman alone in the cold.
That left only one hope: the British. Barclays, the giant British bank, was hungry for a footprint in America. They wanted Lehman's investment banking division, the jewel in the crown, but they didn't want the toxic real estate. A complex deal began to take shape. The Wall Street CEOs at the Fed would pool their money to create a bad bank to absorb the toxic assets, allowing Barclays to buy the good bank. It was a Rube Goldberg machine of finance, fragile and complicated, but it was the only plan left. Richard Fuld sat in his office, excluded from the meetings at the Fed, waiting for the phone to ring. He was pacing, impotent, while his life's work was being dissected by strangers. He clung to the Barclays deal like a drowning man to a plank. He told his wife, "I think we have a deal. I think we're going to make it." Sunday morning, September 14. The sun rose over a city that was jogging, eating brunch, and walking dogs, completely oblivious to the fact that the financial system was rigged with explosives set to detonate. Inside the Federal Reserve, the mood was cautiously optimistic. The lawyers had worked through the night. The complex structure to save Lehman seemed to be holding. The consortium of banks would backstop the bad assets, and Barclays would buy the good business. It was ugly, but it was a survival plan. Then, at 1 p.m., the phone rang. It was the British Financial Services Authority, FSA. The regulators in London had been watching the deal with growing horror. They saw an American mess being offloaded onto a British bank. They saw the potential for the contagion to cross the Atlantic and sink the UK economy. When the Fed officials asked them to waive a shareholder vote to allow the deal to close instantly, the British answer was a cold, flat no. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, Alistair Darling, reportedly said, "I am not willing to import your cancer." The deal was dead. The news hit the conference room at the New York Fed like a physical blow. The exhausted CEOs, running on adrenaline and stale coffee, slumped in their chairs. There was no Plan C. Bank of America was gone. Barclays was gone. The government was refusing to write a check. The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by the realization that the unthinkable was now inevitable. At Lehman headquarters, the hope evaporated. Richard Fuld was finally given the news. There is no buyer. You are alone. Then came the order from the government. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a command. Treasury Secretary Paulson and Tim Geithner told the Lehman legal team that they had to file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy before midnight. They could not allow the markets to open in Asia with Lehman in a state of limbo. The firm had to be euthanized immediately to clarify the legal standing of trillions of dollars in trades. For a firm that had existed since 1850, the end came with terrifying bureaucratic speed. In the boardroom, the directors gathered for a final mournful vote. They were signing the death warrant of their own legacy. Downstairs, the lawyers were frantically typing up the petition. It was a rush job. They were copy-pasting from standard templates, filling in the blanks of a tragedy. Richard Fuld sat at the head of the table, a king without a kingdom. The man who had vowed to rip the hearts out of his enemies was now signing a piece of paper that admitted total defeat. He looked shell-shocked. The anger was gone, replaced by a hollow disbelief. He asked if there was any other way, a suspension of trading, a wind-down. The answer was no. The government wanted a body. As the clock ticked toward midnight, the staff at Lehman began to realize it was over. The email went out. The weeping started again. But this time, it wasn't just sadness, it was panic. They weren't just losing their jobs, they were losing their access to the building. Security guards were already moving to secure the exits. The IT systems were being locked down. At 1:45 a.m. on Monday, September 15, 2008, the lawyers clicked Submit. Lehman Brothers Holdings, Inc. filed for protection under Chapter 11 of the U.S. Bankruptcy Code. It listed $639 billion in assets and $613 billion in debt. It was, by far, the largest bankruptcy in the history of the world, 6 times larger than Enron. The bank that had existed since 1850, the Civil War, 2 World Wars, and the Great Depression, was dead. And then the sun came up in Tokyo. When the markets opened on Monday morning, the moral hazard lesson that the government intended to teach turned into a global suicide pact.
The bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers did not just remove a bad actor, it stopped the heart of the financial system. The immediate reaction was terror. The Dow Jones Industrial Average plunged 500 points, but the real destruction was happening in the plumbing of the economy, in places the average person couldn't see. The commercial paper market, the boring short-term loans that companies like General Electric and Toyota use to pay their workers and buy raw materials, froze solid. No one would lend money to anyone because no one knew who was next. If Lehman could die, anyone could die. Then the unthinkable happened. A massive money market fund, the Reserve Primary Fund, announced that it had lost hundreds of millions on Lehman debt. It broke the buck. Its value fell below $1 per share. This was the financial equivalent of the sun not rising. Money market funds were supposed to be as safe as cash. Suddenly, grandmothers and pension funds were panic selling their safe investments. The run on the bank wasn't just on Wall Street anymore. It was on Main Street.
Hank Paulson and Ben Bernanke, sitting in Washington, watched the monitors with growing horror. They realized too late that they had miscalculated. They thought Lehman was a cancer they could cut out. Instead, they discovered that Lehman was the aorta. By letting it burst, they had induced a massive cardiac arrest in the global economy. Panic turned to chaos. On Tuesday, AIG, the world's largest insurance company, began to collapse. AIG had insured billions of dollars of the toxic subprime junk that Lehman and others had created. If AIG fell, it wouldn't just be a bank failure. It would be the end of the aviation industry, the construction industry, and the retirement savings of millions. The government blinked. Having let Lehman die on Sunday to prove a point, on Tuesday they signed a check for $85 billion to save AIG. The moral hazard doctrine lasted exactly 48 hours. But it was too late for Lehman. The firm was already being carved up by vultures. Barclays, the British bank that had been blocked from buying the company on Sunday, swooped in on Tuesday and bought the core U.S. business for just $250 million. They bought the skyscraper, the computers, and the employees for the price of a few private jets. Richard Fuld sat in his office one last time. He had lost his fortune, his reputation, and his empire. The employees who packed their boxes and walked out onto 7th Avenue were not just angry, they were bewildered. They had been told they were the best, the toughest, the smartest. Now they were the punchline of a global joke. The liquidation of Lehman Brothers would take years. It would trigger the Great Recession. It would lead to millions of lost homes and lost jobs across the world. It would spark political movements from Occupy Wall Street to the Tea Party. The blast radius of that one bankruptcy filing in the middle of the night stretched from the boardrooms of London to the tent cities of California. The Lehman name, once a symbol of immigrant success and American solidity, was scrubbed from the building. The signage was taken down, but the scar remained. History is a circle. 164 years before the collapse, Henry Lehman stood on a dusty road in Alabama. He had nothing but a wagon and a dream. He built that dream on the simple idea of value, that a piece of cotton, a shirt, or a handshake meant something. He and his brothers built a bridge between the old world and the new, between the soil and the bank. For generations, the Lehman family understood that finance was a servant of the real economy. You lent money so a railroad could be built, so a store could open, so a nation could grow. They were architects of the Gilded Age, the roaring engines of the 20th century. But somewhere along the way, the servant became the master. The wagon was traded for the Ferrari.
The cotton was traded for the derivative. The partnership was traded for the corporation. The firm stopped building things and started betting on things. They stopped looking at the character of the people they lent to and started looking only at the mathematical models on their screens. In the end, Lehman Brothers didn't die because of a bad weekend in 2008. It died because it lost its soul. It forgot the lesson of the shopkeeper, that you cannot sell what you do not own, and you cannot spend what you do not have. Today, the glass tower in Times Square still stands. The tickers still flash. The traders still shout. But the name Lehman is gone, whispering to us from the history books, a warning that ambition, unchecked by humility, is just a slower form of suicide. The cotton rots, the gold rusts, and the wagon eventually breaks down.